Now, everybody knows the story of Atlantis. Whether you're 5 or 35, you've heard it before. There was a city of high technology that once was above water but was destroyed and sunk deep into the ocean. Well, what if something like that actually happened? Now, I'm gonna present some evidence that paints a really clear picture that there were people of high technology way before we were supposed to be a lost civilization that had been forgotten by time. Now, there's a lot you need to understand in order to see the big picture and fit all the puzzle pieces into it. I'm going to try to keep this as short as possible. I don't want to make a 2 hour long video. I don't think anybody's going to sit through that. What I really want is to touch on certain things and paint a picture that you can understand, and hopefully you'll take this and you'll do some research yourself. You'll dive deeper into it, and I really suggest you do, because it's very interesting. Now, I'm gonna primarily focus on Egypt, the Sphinx, and the pyramid, uh, and I'm gonna focus on Göbekli Tepe, which is a giant megalithic structure that we just found a few years ago, and we've been excavating since then, and only about 30% of the site has been uncovered, and that's located in Turkey. I'm also going to talk about the origin of Atlantis itself, as well as the end of the last ice age, and old maps that have been passed down through history that show things that our ancestors should not have known and should not have been able to map. Now, I'm going to start with the Sphinx first. The Sphinx is supposed to be roughly 5,000 years old, but there's strong evidence to suggest that it's at least 12,000 years old. And fun little fact: there was a famous psychic. His name was Edgar Cayce, and he predicted that the secrets of Atlantis would be found underneath the paw of the Sphinx. Well, many years later, we find that there is a chamber underneath the paw of the Sphinx. And to my knowledge, I could be wrong, but I don't believe anybody's ever stepped foot in this chamber or done any kind of exploration in this chamber. Again, I could be wrong, but that's not entirely, it's not exactly relevant to this presentation. You don't need that piece of information, at least to understand the big picture. Um, Now, I told you already that the Sphinx is most likely at least 12,000 years old, and the reasoning for this is the pretty clear evidence of rainwater erosion that are on the back of the Sphinx and the Sphinx enclosure. This is rainfall that, or this could only be caused by thousands of years of heavy rainfall. There's a problem with this because the last time it rained like that in the Nile Valley was about 12,000 years ago. And back then, Egypt was not a desert. It was very lush. It was very green. You had trees. You had rivers. You had, it was a very nice place to live. Now, since the landscape has changed, you haven't seen rain like that. Period. No. If you they would have you believe, the modern academics would have you believe that this erosion is caused by wind and sand, but I'm going to show you extreme examples of what and sand erosion look like, and what rain erosion looks like. Now, here's a picture that showed an example of wind erosion, sand erosion, and water erosion. Now, you can see the wind and sand erosion on the right. and on the left you have rainwater erosion. And you can see they look nothing alike. They're drastically different. You can tell the difference clearly. There are no similarities whatsoever. Now, this is a picture of the Sphinx enclosure right here. And you look at it, it very much resembles the example that I showed you, rain erosion. I do see some wind and sand erosion on here, but I also see rain erosion. And what's not in dispute about this is that these lines and grooves and crevices that have created a trickle effect running down the rock, it's erosion. Nobody disagrees on that, but I don't understand how mainstream academia can try to pass this off as complete wind and sand erosion. It doesn't look anything alike. Now, if we agree that this is indeed rainwater erosion, then this means that the Sphinx would have had to be standing there 12,000 years ago to get rained on. Now, it's probably older than that, but that's when the last time it rained heavy like that in the Nile Valley. Now, here's a picture of the Sphinx as a whole. Now, take a look at the body. You can, well, first, it looks much more, it looks like it's in worse shape than the head does. You can see all the repairs that have been done to it from different errors. You can see all the damage to it. And then you look at the head, and the head is relatively, it's almost in pristine condition. Well, that's kind of an issue, because for most of the Sphinx's life, it was buried up to the neck in sand. And that would have protected it from the elements and the weather. So you look at the head, which has always been exposed, and then you look at the body, and it's like, well, you would expect this to be reversed. You would expect the head to be in worse condition than the body, and that's really not the case. Now, also, I want you to look at the head itself and see that the head's perfect. It's proportionate with itself. There's no kind of screw up. Then you look at the body, and you can see that it's proportionate with itself as well. It's a lion's body. There's no screw up. Now take a look at the picture as a whole again, and you can see that the head and the body aren't proportionate with each other. You have this huge lion's body with this tiny little head that has had, that you can see a flat, just, I'm going to call it a walkway. It's not a walkway, obviously, but it's flat from the back all the way up to the head. Now, this is my opinion. I believe that the head of the Sphinx, well, the Sphinx monument itself was originally a lion monument, completely, and that the Sphinx the body had been buried and the head had been exposed, so the head would have been constantly bombarded and destroyed and disfigured, and it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't have survived like that. So it's likely that it had been recarved at some point in its history. Obviously, it does resemble Pharaoh, and there's more to that, because it's also possible that it could be a Nubian, which they conquered Egypt, and their pharaohs looked more African-like, but again, that's not particularly relevant to this presentation. But yeah, so I believe that the Sphinx was a lion-headed monument originally, which would make sense because the Sphinx is associated with the constellation of Leo the lion, not Leo the half man, half lion, Leo the lion. Now, let's talk about the pyramids, the Great Pyramids. I'm not going to delve into the history or the theories of what the purposes of these monuments were. There were probably many purposes and many traditions over the years. Probably different ones for different kings or whatever. But I will tell you that the uh, the pyramids are associated with the constellation of Orion, particularly Orion's belt, Orion the Hunter. They're aligned perfectly to true north. Well, I'm sorry, they're not. They're not perfect. It's about 3/60ths of a single degree off, and but they align almost perfectly to true north. Now, this is something that our modern minds have failed to do. The Greenwich Observatory in England was supposed to be designed, and our attempt at aligning a monument or a building to true north as best we could, and that was off more than the pyramid. I don't remember exactly how much. I want to say it was 12 degrees. I could be wrong, but what I'm not wrong about is the pyramids are more accurately aligned than this is. Now, I'm going to take this back 12,000 years ago. At the exact same time, well, first you have the Sphinx, which we said is the celestial counterpart of the Leo the lion. And we've already established that Orion is associated with the Great Pyramids. Now you look at the position 12,000 years ago of the pyramids, and they align perfectly to the three dots in Orion's belt. Now at the same time, 12,000 years ago, you see the Sphinx face the constellation of Leo. Now, you also see the Nile, which in the picture I'm about to show you is they show the Nile receded, but they have lines where it used to run, and that lines up almost perfectly with how the Milky Way, the edge of the Milky Way, would have looked back then. Now, here you see the three pyramids, and then you see them lined to the constellation of Orion. You see the Sphinx, and you see it facing towards the sun, and rising is the constellation of Leo on the horizon. Now take a look at the Nile, and again, remember that the blue part is the Nile receded. The outline is where it used to be at that time. And then you'll see the edge of the Milky Way galaxy where it would have been positioned 12,000 years ago. And how we can accurately judge where these constellations were at these times is there's a wobble on the Earth's axis. And think of it like this. You spin a top on the floor. As the top slows down, it starts to wobble. Now that's what happens when the Earth rotates. It rotates on a wobble, and it takes about 30,000 years, give or take, to complete a full cycle. And in this time, the sky slowly moves and changes. And different constellations will appear in different points. Different stars will appear in different points of the sky. Of course, the zodiac. The zodiac is based off of this. Right now, we are in the age of Pisces, and we're about to enter the age of Aquarius. So this is how we know that these monuments lock at this particular date, as well as the edge of the Milky Way. So it's pretty interesting, a pretty interesting coincidence that these things line up. And this date, 12,000. Now I'm going to talk about a place called Göbekli Tepe, and this was found a few years ago in Turkey. Farmer just happened to be, digging up his land, and all of a sudden he finds this amazing monument with it, which is a massive, or you have massive circular pillars that go on forever almost. And you'll see in these pictures all those circles that are kind of transparent. Those are yet to be excavated structures. The ones that are above ground, that are solid, you'll see they're solid. Those are what have been excavated already. So only about 30% has been excavated, and it's massive. It has very detailed 3D pillars that depict several types of creatures. They have animals that we would recognize. We have animals we've never seen before, animals that weren't even indigenous to that area. We have carvings of humanoids, and no one is in dispute about this. The site is at least 12,000 years old. And we know this from the carbon dating that's been done at the site. And it puts it at 12,000 years old. No one's in dispute of this, but here's a problem. This site itself throws the whole historical timeline completely out of whack. 12,000 years ago, we were only supposed to be hunter-gatherers, living in small tribes, living off the land. We followed the game. We lived in small huts and tents, and we were not supposed to have the capability to do something like this. And so somebody had to make this place. According to the historical timeline, it can't be us. Nobody wants to talk about this. No, nobody wants to accept this. They agree that the site is that old, but somehow they're trying to fit it into their already established timeline. Now, everybody knows the story of Noah and his ark, which, from the Bible. One man and his family load up 2 of every type of animal in the world. And Noah's Ark is said to rest on Mount Sinai, which is in Turkey, and it's not far from where Göbekli Tepe was found. This is my personal theory, and I don't know if anyone else has considered this, if anybody else is working on this, if they agree or not, but I personally think that Göbekli Tepe is the origin of the story of Noah's Ark. And the reason that I believe this is because of the depictions that are on all the pillars, and we haven't even uncovered all of them yet. It shows many different types of creatures and species. It's a record literally written in stone. And another interesting fact is that the site of Göbekli Tepe was intentionally buried 12,000 years ago. And I'm not going to go into how we know that because I don't feel like explaining the whole process, but you can look it up whenever you get a chance, whenever you want to, and you'll see how we know that the site was intentionally buried. Now, the Ice Age, the last Ice Age, began to come to a swift end, and the ice started to rapidly melt, and sea level rose 300 feet overnight. Now, at that time, which coincidentally, 12,000 years ago when this happened, and at that time, the inlands they weren't a great place to set up shop. They were basically desert, barren. There was very little rain, very little water, food. That wasn't an ideal spot to live. The the uh, the coasts, however, were very much comfortable. They had water. They had food. They had pretty much whatever they needed to survive there for extended periods of time, long periods of time. So, when sea level rose 300 feet overnight, 12,000 years ago, anything on those coastlines is gone. It's wiped out. It's not there anymore. There's completely wiped out without a trace. Much like the myth of Atlantis. This did happen. Whether you believe that there were people there or not, this did happen. Now, there are also very old maps that really show us extraordinary things that our sailors back then should not have known, and how they came to be in possession of these maps is a matter of mystery. There's one famous map. It's called the Piri Reis map, and Piri Reis was a Turkish admiral who was allowed entrance into the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. This was, of course, back when all the great libraries were there around the world. They were all burnt down. Everything in them just burnt down. There's very little that survived, and that's a damn shame, because we lost so much information, so much. But Admiral Piri Reis would he began to sketch things that he saw on these maps. He would sketch them, and he would take them with him. And a very famous map of his that he sketched is, well, it shows what Antarctica looks like underneath the ice. How would anyone back then know what Antarctica looked like under the ice? Antarctica wouldn't even have been discovered for another 300 plus years, let alone what its terrain looks like under the ice. That's ridiculous. Somebody obviously mapped these parts of the world, if we have these maps. And this is not the only map that we have. There are several others, and they show interesting markers on these maps where there are certain places that we should not have known about. For example, there was an island. It's called High Brazil, and it had been underwater, or once it was above water, but it has been underwater for a very long time. Well, on one of these maps, you have this island in the exact place mapped out. How would anyone know about this place underneath that water? They didn't have scuba gear. They couldn't go diving. There were no submarines. Not only that, but it would have been very difficult to navigate the waters at this time. We have latitude and longitude, and one of them can be accurately judged and one of them cannot. And this is a big part of the reason why ships used to crash on the shorelines, because they couldn't accurately predict where they were going. So it was a very difficult time back then to pilot a ship, let alone do recon of this nature. It's preposterous, but somebody did it. Somebody had to do it. Somebody with technology. And it wasn't before marine chronometers were invented that we could finally accurately judge latitude and longitude. And they weren't around back then. So who originally created these maps. Now, the last thing I'm going to touch on is the origin of Atlantis itself, and the original surviving written story comes from Plato, the Greek philosopher, and he tells of a high civilization with technology, and he describes some of the devices, what they had, and this city was wiped out by a flood and sunk to the bottom of the ocean. Everybody's been searching for it since. Well, this story, which Plato tells himself, he got from another Greek philosopher named Solon. I believe that the two were related, but I'm not sure, and again, that's not really relevant to the story. Solon, in turn, got it from Egypt on one of his trips. Plato gives a date for this city when it had existed. And the date he gives is 2,000 years before the time of Solon. So, 9,000 years before the time of Solon. So, you add 2,000 years onto that, which is about the time when Plato, from now to when Plato wrote his story. It's been about 2,000 years. So add 2,000 years on the 9,000, and you have 11,000 years. Putting this supposed Atlantean civilization right around the time of the last ice age, and when the pyramids were built, and when the monuments aligned, and these dates, they show up everywhere in history, but I don't want to go on a 2-hour rant about it. I'd like you to research it yourself and dive into this, because it's very fascinating. Something catastrophic happened 12,000 years ago. From the rapid melting of the ice age, when the sea level rose 300 feet, to the giant comets that had hit the Earth, and there were so many other disasters that took place at this time. Now, I believe there was a civilization back then that existed, one that's been forgotten about time, and I believe it was largely destroyed. I also believe that the survivors of this civilization settled in different parts of the world, and they began to teach the indigenous people their history and their technology in the form of myths. Ways that their minds could all understand at that time. Ways for their story to survive. That's why a lot of religions, they're very similar. Their traditions are similar, and a perfect example of this is when I was talking about Noah's Ark earlier. Noah's Ark is a ripoff, a blatant ripoff of the Epic of Gilgamesh, which the Epic of Gilgamesh is a story that's a lot older than the story of Noah's Ark. But they tell the same story, and they weren't close. The civilizations weren't close to each other, so it's hard to believe that they had communicated these stories with each other. So they individually came up with these stories. So that means that, well, it suggests that this event did indeed happen, and all over the world there's evidence and myths that will point you in that direction. So that's pretty much it. Atlantis, I titled it Atlantis because I always liked the name Atlantis. So Atlantis did exist. It wasn't a city. It was a global civilization. seafaring civilization, and they had technology, deep sea ships, the ability to create giant megalithic structures, almost, almost. They're beautiful. They're perfect, and all of this evidence really, really throws or hurls the mainstream academics' views on history. They need to be questioned. They need to be reevaluated. And nobody is willing to do this. Why? Well, one reason, and this is absolutely for sure whether they're intentionally doing it or not, is if they suddenly accept this new evidence, if they consider this new evidence, then all of a sudden the work that they've been teaching their students, the work that they've based their entire careers on, that they've sold their books about, all of this is called into question, and suddenly they have to rethink everything that they've been teaching, for half their lives. I'm sure they don't want to do that. That's going to damage their career. Now I would think they would welcome these new ideas and new possibilities, but that's just not the case. So please, do your research. Look into this. More people need to catch on to this. More people need to fight for it, because we should know our history. We should know where we come from. And nobody should be able to keep that from us. So look it up.